Okay, so you know how it is online, right? Like you think you've seen everything and then bam, something crazy happens out of nowhere. Like the internet just keeps on interneting, you know? Throws you these curveballs and suddenly everyone's talking about the wildest stuff.
Huh.
We're going to do a deep dive today. Yeah, a deep dive into three topics. They've all been blowing up online.
You really found some interesting sources this time. They seem completely different at first glance, but when you dig a little deeper, some really interesting connections start popping up. You've picked out three main areas to focus on, right?
Exactly. So first up, we're going to unpack this whole thing with straight husbands. You know, they're finding themselves right in the middle of all these Justin Baldoni case discussions. And there's this one TikToker, his take on Ryan Reynolds is just so direct, so blunt, you know? It's definitely raised some eyebrows. Then we're going to switch gears and look at the defamation lawsuit, the one Justin Baldoni's team filed against the New York Times. And there's been a pretty big development. The Times is actually trying to get the whole case dismissed. And then finally, we're going to dive back into the Becoming Brit series, the one about Brigitte Macron. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger globally. People like Tucker Carlson are weighing in. And internationally, there are some really strong opinions flying around.
It's a pretty diverse mix of topics, for sure. But as we go through them, I think you'll see there are some fascinating underlying themes that connect them, particularly around how information spreads online these days, and how these different narratives, well, they take hold and then they get challenged.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's start with the whole straight husbands and Ryan Reynolds thing.
Yeah.
So remember how we've been talking about the Justin Baldoni story? Well, one of the things that's happened is that a lot of wives have been getting really into all the online discussions about it. And their husbands, well, they're just trying to, go about their day, and suddenly they're getting dragged into it. Their wives are showing them all the drama and asking for their opinions. It's kind of funny when you think about it.
It just shows how these online discussions can really spill over into everyday life.
Yeah.
Even for people who weren't really paying attention at first. It's like that ripple effect.
Yeah.
You throw a pebble in a pond and the ripples just keep spreading outward.
Yeah, exactly. And one of these husbands, a TikToker he calls himself, put the dog on the phone, which I gotta say is a pretty awesome username. He was watching all this unfold from the sidelines and then just drops this incredibly blunt assessment of Ryan Reynolds. It went completely viral. And when you hear his reasoning, it's kind of hard not to see why it caught people's attention.
So what was it about his take that resonated with so many people? What was the core of his argument?
Well, he focuses on those leaked text messages, specifically that line, "Oh, he's gay." And his immediate reaction is basically, straight guys don't talk like that. He's clear that he's not judging anyone or anything. He's just saying that it's not something you'd normally hear a straight guy say. And from that one observation, he jumps into this much bigger theory.
So what's the theory? What's he saying about Ryan Reynolds?
He's basically saying that Ryan Reynolds is a closeted gay man. He starts putting together what he sees as evidence from Reynolds' public image. He talks about the twinkle in Reynolds' eyes, compares it to what he calls the dead eyes of straight men, which is a pretty striking image, right? He talks about Reynolds' whole demeanor, and then he brings up specific moments, like that time he kissed Andrew Garfield, all playful, and of course the whole award-stealing thing with Ryan Gosling. He's building a narrative here based on these little clues and moments.
It's wild how these seemingly innocent public interactions can be taken completely out of context and used to support a whole different interpretation of someone's personal life.
Yeah.
It's like we, as the audience, we project our own interpretations onto celebrities.
Absolutely. And he doesn't stop there. He brings up the whole beard theory, the idea that women have been used to hide men's homosexuality throughout history. And then he makes this pretty harsh comment about Reynolds being with someone young but objectively stupid, implying that it's all part of this performance, this facade.
That's pretty rough.
Right.
Not very nice to Blake Lively at all. It's important to remember, listeners, that this is just one person's opinion, however popular it might have become. But it shows how harsh online commentary can be sometimes.
Absolutely. And what I find really interesting is where he ends up. His conclusion is that because Reynolds isn't being true to himself publicly, it's leading to this weird, crazy behavior that affects the people around him. Like it's this inner turmoil that's spilling out into his actions.
So he's not just speculating about Reynolds' sexuality. He's connecting it to what he sees as negative aspects of Reynolds' behavior in public and how that behavior affects other people.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? This TikToker's very blunt assessment actually kind of lines up with some of the earlier, more polite attempts to understand what's been going on with Reynolds. There's been this undercurrent of discussion about how his demeanor seems to have changed and what might be causing it. Even some whispers about those long-standing rumors of lavender marriages in Hollywood, which we all know have been a part of celebrity gossip for
It's
decades.
interesting, right? Those rumors are usually based on speculation and gossip, not actual evidence.
No.
But they do reflect the pressure that existed in the entertainment industry, this pressure to maintain a certain public image and to keep your sexuality hidden. It's fascinating how societal norms can influence the stories we tell about celebrities.
Totally. And even in those more subtle observations, you can sense the similar feeling to what that TikToker was saying. Like the idea that Ryan Reynolds is not happy with who he is on the inside and that this unhappiness is coming out in some pretty vicious ways. It's a pretty serious accusation based on, a lot of interpretation and assumptions.
Definitely. And it shows how quickly a narrative can take off online,
Hmm.
especially when it involves a celebrity, even without solid proof. So listeners, this is something to think about. How do we evaluate information online? And what are the implications of this kind of speculation on people's lives?
Right. Okay, so let's move on to something totally different but equally important. The lawsuit that Justin Baldoni's team filed against the New York Times, this is a big deal. They're accusing the Times of some pretty serious stuff. Defamation, portraying him in a false light, invasion of privacy.
Those are some heavy accusations. They go straight to the heart of freedom of the press and how we protect individual reputations. And the New York Times has come back with a pretty strategic response. They filed a motion to dismiss the entire case. Why do you think they're doing that?
They're claiming fair reporter privilege. It's also called the public proceedings or public records privilege. Basically, this legal protection means that news organizations can report on official government documents and statements made in official settings like court filings without being sued for defamation. As long as their reporting is fair and accurate, it's there to protect journalists when they're covering public records.
So the Times is saying that their reporting was protected under this privilege because they were simply reporting on what was in the complaint that was filed with the California Civil Rights Department, or the CRD. And because of that, they should be immune from these accusations and the case should be thrown out.
Yeah, that's their main argument. But Brian Friedman and his legal team, the ones representing Baldoni, well, they disagree strongly. They're saying that the New York Times completely abandoned that privilege with their reporting, and they don't mince words in their filings. Friedman even calls the New York Times a pietistic bastion of the media establishment that thinks it's beyond accountability. They're definitely coming out swinging.
Wow, that's strong language. Sounds like there's a major disagreement about how the New York Times handled the initial reporting of the complaint. What are Friedman's main arguments for why he thinks the fair report privilege shouldn't apply here?
His main point is that the New York Times didn't just rehash the information from the filed complaint. He says their article and the video that went with it were based on their own review of thousands of pages of documents. And they specifically said that Lively's claims had been verified through their own investigation. Friedman's arguing that this goes way beyond simply summarizing a public document, and that because of that, they can't claim fair report privilege.
That's a crucial difference. If the Times presented the information as their own verified findings, and not just allegations from a complaint, it totally changes the nature of their reporting. And it could definitely affect their ability to use that privilege as a defense. So listeners, this is about understanding the difference between reporting on a document and reporting based on a much broader investigation.
Exactly. And there's another interesting legal move here. The Times also tried to argue that some of the statements in their reporting were hyperbolic and non-actionable opinion. But Friedman points out the problem with this. If they were just stating opinions, how can they also claim protection under fair report privilege? That privilege is for factual reporting of official proceedings. It seems like they're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, it does sound a bit contradictory. You can't really say you're objectively reporting facts from a legal document and then turn around and say your statements were just subjective opinions that shouldn't be taken as fact.
And then there's the whole question of jurisdiction. Should this case be heard in California, which is what Baldoni's team wants, or in New York, which is what the New York Times wants? Why is the location of the court such a big deal in a case like this?
Jurisdiction matters a lot in defamation cases because the specific laws about defamation and other related things like portraying someone in a false light and invasion of privacy, well, those laws can be quite different from state to state. For instance, California is a lot like Tennessee in that it has really strong legal protections for free speech. They have what are called anti-SLAPP laws. Listeners, the main thing to know about anti-SLAPP laws is that they're designed to stop powerful people or organizations from using lawsuits to shut down criticism about issues of public concern. Also, California recognizes legal claims for false light and invasion of privacy. New York doesn't.
So Friedman is making a strong argument for California jurisdiction. He points out that two of the companies named in the lawsuit, it ends with Us Movie LLC, and the agency group PR are based in California. And he emphasizes that those companies, along with the individuals involved, like Justin Baldoni himself and his PR people, that they all do business in California, and that's where their reputations were allegedly harmed.
He's basically saying that the main impact of the alleged defamation happened in California, so California law should apply to the case.
Right. He even brings up legal precedence cases that have already been decided. He's arguing that if the harm from the defamation was mainly felt in a certain state, then that state's laws should apply even if the reporting itself came from somewhere else. It's sometimes called the impact rule in these jurisdiction disputes.
Yeah, that impact argument is key in figuring out jurisdiction, especially now with the internet. Information can spread so fast across state lines. Courts often look at where the plaintiff, the person suing, experienced the most damage to their reputation and their business.
The New York Times, not surprisingly, is saying New York law should apply because that's where they did the reporting. They wrote the article there, they published it there. But Friedman argues that they need to go through the discovery process to really figure out how much coordination there was and where the main decisions about the article were actually made. He's suggesting that the Times might not be telling the whole story about how the reporting happened.
That makes sense. Discovery could reveal details about how the reporters, the editors, and the legal team all worked together, and where the real editorial control was.
And Friedman brings it all back to his main point. The New York Times' reporting went way beyond a fair and true report of what was in the CRD complaint. He argues that it created a different impression on the reader by framing the whole thing as an expose, like they were going inside a PR smear machine. And he says that this framing is what makes it liable against Justin Baldoni and his colleague.
So it's not just about whether they reported the facts of the complaint accurately. It's about the story they told around it, how the New York Times presented it to their readers. Friedman is saying they went beyond simply informing the public about a legal filing.
And then there's this pointed connection to the Harvey Weinstein case. They point out that the same reporter, Megan Twohey, was involved in that reporting too. It's like a broader criticism of how much power the media has. They're implying that outlets like the New York Times have a history of hurting people's reputations without any real facts. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It adds a whole other dimension to this legal fight. It suggests a pattern of reporting that the plaintiffs believe is too aggressive or lacks evidence. What happens with this motion to dismiss is going to tell us a lot about how the courts view the balance between journalistic freedom and protection against defamation, especially when reporting on these early legal actions.
All right, let's move on to our last topic for today. Like we said earlier, this is the story that just won't go away. The Becoming Brit series about Brigitte Macron. It's gone seriously viral worldwide, which is kind of crazy to see, especially when you know what's been happening behind the scenes.
It's really captured people's imaginations all over the world. It shows how much intrigue and, even disbelief there is surrounding these claims.
For sure. And Tucker Carlson, he brought up the Becoming Brit story in a recent interview he did with Clayton Morris from Redacted. What was Carlson's take on it initially, and what changed his mind?
Well, at first, Carlson was really skeptical. He said it sounded like flat earth stuff. But then he mentioned that his wife had been watching your deep dive episodes on it, and that actually convinced him there might be something to it after all.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I guess it shows that a deep dive into the evidence, even on a platform like ours, can really change people's minds. So what did Clayton Morris have to say about it during the interview?
Morris went all in. He straight up said, Brigitte Macron is a man who groomed Emmanuel Macron. And then he said that it's a fact. That's pretty bold.
It is. And it's important to remember all the harassment and legal trouble the French journalists Natasha Ray and Xavier Pissar have gone through. They were some of the first to report on these claims publicly, and they've faced a lot of backlash.
Yeah, they've risked a lot, both personally and professionally, by bringing this controversial story to light. It shows what can happen when you report on sensitive topics like this.
And speaking of consequences, that legal letter we got, well, it definitely made us even more determined to keep digging into this story. Sometimes those attempts to shut down information just make it spread even further.
Yeah, it's like that thing they call the Streisand effect. When you're trying to hide or delete information, it can end up getting shared even more widely.
And on a positive note, Xavier Pissar's book, Devenir Brigitte, which means Becoming Brigitte, is apparently a #1 bestseller in France. And he's getting all the profits, which is great. It seems like people are really interested in what he's uncovered.
That's pretty amazing. It shows that despite all the controversy, a lot of people in France are interested in his work and maybe even support it.
And then things get even more interesting internationally. There's a clip going around from a Russian news channel. They're talking about Emmanuel Macron's behavior, and they're saying that he's acting all boisterous and agitated because he's trying to distract people from this scandal. It's fascinating how this narrative is spreading and how it's being used in different political contexts.
It just goes to show how information, especially when it's about powerful political figures, can be used as a weapon.
Hmm.
It gets woven into existing geopolitical narratives, and it serves different countries' interests.
And then we have this crazy development. A French deputy is calling for the return of the Statue of Liberty. He's accusing the U.S. of siding with tyrants. It's not explicitly stated that it's connected to the Brigitte Macron story, but it definitely feels like part of this wave of, heightened reactions and political grandstanding.
That's a pretty unusual and symbolic move. The Statue of Liberty means so much to both the U.S. and France. It represents freedom and democracy. To bring it up in this context suggests there's a lot of political tension and maybe even some frustration.
The White House press secretary was asked about it and basically just shut it down. So the statue is absolutely not going back. And then there's this whole other interpretation of the Statue of Liberty, that it's actually a free Masonic symbol and not just about libertas.
That's definitely a less common interpretation. It comes from looking at history and symbols in a different way. It reminds us that even symbols that everyone thinks they understand can have different meanings. It all depends on your perspective and how you view history and culture.
But the overall message seems to be that liars are angry and they're losing the thread. That headline about the Statue of Liberty, it's presented as an example of how desperate they are. It's pretty confrontational.
Yeah, it suggests that they believe the truth about the becoming Brit claims is becoming more and more obvious, and that these strong reactions are a sign that those who are trying to suppress the truth are feeling the pressure.
And then the conversation shifts to this idea of broader attacks against free media figures. People like Tucker Carlson, yourself, Ian Carroll, and Joe Rogan. And the tactic of calling anyone who disagrees with them anti-Semitic, or even Hitler, this seems to be a big sticking point.
That kind of labeling, using those loaded terms, it can be a way to silence people who have different opinions, to make them seem illegitimate without actually addressing their arguments. Listeners pay attention to this kind of pattern in online discussions.
They give specific examples of headlines and articles from places like the Washington Examiner, the Daily Beast, Mediate, all focusing on this so-called rise of anti-Semitic influencers. Their point is that a lot of these accusations are coming from people who haven't historically been aligned with the groups they're trying to control or critique.
It makes you wonder what their motivations are. Do they really want to combat anti-Semitism? Or are they using it to discredit people who disagree with them politically or independent media figures who challenge the established narrative?
And they directly challenge the claim that Ian Carroll just suddenly came out of nowhere. They point out that he's been on TikTok for a long time talking about everyday stuff like grocery prices. It shows how easy it is for stories to get twisted or misrepresented to fit a certain agenda.
That's why it's so important to look at the full context, the history of what people have actually said and done online. Don't just rely on these simplified or biased accounts.
They're clearly frustrated with this labeling tactic.
Yeah.
They're pointing out that it doesn't just hurt the individuals, it hurts their audience too. It creates this disconnect, and it makes people lose trust in the mainstream media, especially when they know the accusations aren't true.
That's a really important point. When people feel like media outlets are being unfair or inaccurate, it can really hurt their credibility. It makes people distrust them even more.
And then they mention an article in the Jerusalem Post. It talks about how support for Israel is going down among young evangelicals. They suggest that these media tactics might have something to do with it, how certain narratives are being presented. It suggests there could be real-world consequences to all of this.
Yeah, that's a complicated issue, lots of different factors. But it does raise the question of whether how the media presents information can actually change people's opinions about geopolitical issues, for example.
And their conclusion is pretty blunt. They basically call the people using these tactics dweebs who are resorting to lying to try and stay relevant. It's a pretty strong condemnation of how these media strategies are being used.
Yeah, it's a bold statement. It shows how frustrated they are and how much they believe that these tactics are dishonest and damaging to public discourse.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered some really interconnected themes here. The public is becoming more and more skeptical of the stories they're being told. Traditional media outlets are having a hard time keeping up in this new information environment, and information is spreading globally with a huge impact. whether it's about celebrity relationships, legal battles with big news organizations, or the ongoing saga surrounding a major political figure.
Definitely. We're seeing a major shift in the media landscape. The traditional gatekeepers of information are facing more scrutiny than ever before. And they're facing competition from all these independent voices and alternative platforms. The way we consume and share information is changing in a big way.
It really makes you wonder what truth even means anymore, doesn't it? What are the motivations behind the stories we're being told? And what do people's reactions to those stories really tell us? It's something to think about. Maybe spend some time looking into some of the people and events we talked about today. See what you find.
Absolutely. Think about where you're getting your information from. Be aware of potential biases. And be critical of how these narratives can affect how you see the world and what you believe. Things are changing so fast. And having your own informed perspective is more important than ever.